Guy Pearse, you've written a new book called Greenwash. It's quite different from your previous books in the sense that your High and Dry and Quarry Vision were about the politics of climate change action, whereas this is more about corporate or consumer behaviour. Why the shift to this area?
Well, I'd spent over a decade really immersing myself in the politics of climate change, and like many observers, I'd drawn the conclusion that things weren't moving fast enough. But along the way it also became clear that whether it's governments or whether it's consumers, there's a lot of people out there banking on a clean energy revolution happening, and many people out there believe that this is inevitable, if not already happening, that it can't be stopped, and that countries like Australia or the US or wherever you are really need to get on board, or else they're going to get left behind. And a lot of the green movement also seems to buy into this logic. Particularly, you'll see it reflected in a lot of green China stories, or sort of China's going green stories. There was a lot of those out there, and there's a lot of cheerleading amongst the green movement for this green revolution. And you saw the same with governments essentially selling the message that if we price carbon, we can have a clean energy future and that sort of thing. So this is a sort of conventional wisdom that I'd noticed in parallel to this very depressing politics of climate change. And I guess I decided I wanted to ask the question, is that revolution actually occurring? Because most people seem to assume that it was, but very few were really exploring the question. And so I thought, what's the best way of checking whether this green revolution being advertised, both by governments but mainly by large corporations, and checking whether it's actually occurring and whether it's consistent with what the science is telling us about what we need to do to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it seemed to me the best way to do it was to really pull together probably the best collection of green marketing in the world and check what the companies were saying and how this stacked up to what they're actually doing, and whether collectively this amounted to a green revolution that many people believe is occurring.
And what general conclusions did you come to about the performance of larger corporations?
Well, having pulled together a collection of thousands of video commercials and billboard ads, and spending literally years, I spent 4 years trawling through this stuff, and the online ads, and hundreds and hundreds of sustainability reports and annual reports and all the rest of it. Having gone through that, which I liken in the book to Bear Grylls squeezing water of last resort from an elephant dropping, or what Morgan Spurlock did with Super Size Me, eating McDonald's for a month. I argue that what I put myself through with all that green advertising is worse, especially for someone like me who has gone out of their way to design their life so they don't view a lot of advertising. But the conclusion that comes through at the end of all that is that the revolution being advertised simply isn't happening, which is a fairly depressing conclusion, but it's unambiguous. What I found was that almost every large corporation has been for years now putting together a very conspicuous and well-resourced green marketing campaign, often very concentrated on one or two green products that they're selling, but as part of a greening of their brand more broadly, and behind which, in almost every single case, was a rising carbon footprint.
So how do companies fix their carbon figures?
Well, one of the tricks of the trade is to design your emission targets in such a way that you're going to probably meet them without doing a great deal. So a good example is Yum Brands, which owns KFC, Taco Bell and Pizza Hut, and they have 38,000 restaurants around the world. So what they've done is they have a pretty grand looking target to reduce their energy use by 10%. And it looks pretty impressive, and you think they're going to have to do a lot to get to that target, until you think to yourself, well, how can they do that when they're adding, I think, close to 4 new stores every day around the world, and then you look at the fine print and you realise that this only applies to company-owned stores, and then you dig down into the annual report and you discover that the number of company-owned stores is actually falling, and the vast majority of Yum Brands' growth, those extra new restaurants being added every day, are franchise stores. to which that target doesn't apply. So that company can put out its grand looking target, say they're on track to be meeting it, largely because the number of company-owned stores is falling anyway, for nothing to do with environment reasons, and yet their overall carbon footprint is still growing. And that's before we even start talking about the indirect carbon footprint tied up in producing all the ingredients that go into that food.
Another very visible industry where we talk about carbon offsets is the airline industry. How do their programs work, and do they serve to offset many of the flights that people take?
The answer is no. In most cases, the percentage of passengers offsetting their flight is less than 5%. So I think it's 3% is considered quite a good rate. And in most cases, though, airlines don't publish that information. But what they do instead is to put forward that offsetting program as evidence of their commitment to the environment. It's also a very clever way of shifting the responsibility subtly from themselves onto the customer. So even though the airline itself might be expanding its fleet pretty dramatically, say in the example of Qatar Airways, the percentage of passengers offsetting their flight is minuscule, but this shifts the responsibility off the airline onto them. And so this is a very common tactic for airlines to use.
What about hotels? I've got off the plane, I'm checking into my hotel, I pick up my little card which says this hotel is a very environmentally friendly organisation, welcome, don't wash your towels today, yeah. We're saving forests. What's the extent of hotels' carbon emissions reductions?
Very poor is a short answer. So if you look across most of the large hotel chains, you do find these very eagerly promoted environment programs, and you also find quite ambitious sounding claims to climate friendliness. So in the case of, say, Hilton Hotel, they say they've cut their carbon output by around 7%. I think in the case of Marriott, you find them saying that they've cut their absolute emissions by around 11%. You look at Wyndham, another large hotels corporation, you find they've got this Wyndham Green program, and they're pointing to lots of things that are happening.
Very impressive figures to me.
It's all very impressive, and then you look more closely and you find that Hilton doesn't say what they mean by 7%. It could be carbon per square foot of floor space. It could be, per guest. But what it doesn't say, because it isn't specific about that, you don't know whether the overall amount of CO2 being put out and other greenhouse gases is increasing or falling, because in the case of Hilton, they're growing by twice that rate each year that they're claiming the emissions have been reduced. So if it is a carbon per square foot, carbon dioxide per square foot, and they're growing at 15%, and they're cutting the emissions by 7%, well, the overall impact is getting larger and larger. And in the case of Marriott, another example, where I was initially thinking this was a good news story until I looked at the fine print and discovered that they were only taking responsibility for what they called their managed estate, which is around half the hotels bearing the Marriott brands. And then you look again at the annual reports and you find that the franchised properties are growing at 4 times the rate of the managed hotels. So even though they're doing quite well with the properties that they manage exclusively, the overall footprint of the hotels bearing the Marriott brands is still going up. But this is a clever way of disguising that.
You seem to suggest that it's more or less a template now that large corporations apply. Let's say I've been hired to improve the environmental credentials of, say, a large car maker. What would be the first thing that I'd do?
Well, there's a list of things. I put together a sort of tongue-in-cheek template list of dot points of what you would do if you were just appointed as the head of sustainability at any Fortune 500 company. And we can run through them. I mean, first of all, you would come up with a new green logo and a slogan. Then you might put together a green team within the company and make it mandatory for them to look enthusiastic as they maintain their Facebook sites showcasing all of the great green things that a company is doing. You put out a glossy annual report, a sustainability report, or say in the case of McDonald's, they call it the best of global best of green, which is very carefully designed so that there are lots of isolated stories of where the company is doing something that treads more lightly on the planet, but very carefully avoids communicating what that all adds up to, avoiding communicating a cumulative carbon footprint for the company. You might join up with an environmental group as part of their Climate Savers campaign, say with WWF. You'll switch off for Earth Hour. You make a donation to offset some carbon in a distant developing country by planting a few trees with a stamp of approval from another environment group. There's a whole host of things that you can do that give the appearance that the company is going green. You can have the CEO make grand speeches, embracing the science, calling on government to get on with it. There's so many things that they tend to do, but what you find is that they all follow a very similar template. So no matter whether you're selling beer or hamburgers or real estate, or Boeing 737s, the same template is followed.
But you argue that it's essentially that they're just empty actions. How can you tell that they're not having an impact on the carbon footprint generally of a company? How are companies audited in terms of their carbon emissions?
Well, they're generally not audited. There's no higher authority auditing them. It's up to companies to make the decision to first measure and then make public the information on the extent of their carbon footprint. So what tends to happen is that most large companies will lodge a return with the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is an international vehicle set up by large investors, and the aim of it is that investors will get a better idea of what is the exposure of the carbon liabilities of large companies. So many of them will make returns to that. Many of them off their own bat will release as part of their sustainability report some data on what their carbon footprint is. But the problem we have is how we define our carbon footprint. So really when we talk about a big brand, everything that we look at the products that are sold under a big brand, the carbon footprint of those products is much, much greater than almost every large multinational lets on.
I'm interested in your book when you talk about the greenwashing of environmental organisations themselves. It seems that they often become complicit in corporations' actions to look greener. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Well, I think a lot of the collaboration between environmental groups and large corporations is well intentioned. There's a genuine desire to find leaders amongst the business community. So there's an eagerness to have them to sort of put up in lights, if you like, those that are doing relatively better than the others. Unfortunately, there's also a dependency that has evolved whereby the same environmental groups become sort of addicted to corporate money. So in the case of WWF, for example, each year they're getting $60 million in donations from large corporations, which gives them a fair incentive to represent those individual companies as doing quite well. Conservation International is another good example, and probably a better one, where they pull together a large group of multinationals that have, in many cases, the worst offenders when it comes to greenwashing, and through some tree planting activities in distant developing countries, they help enable these corporations to represent themselves as doing great green things.
So where along the line do things go so wrong? Because essentially people who would join the sustainable development units of large companies, many of them would believe in the actions that they're undertaking. There is a genuine desire amongst people, presumably in companies, to actually improve their environmental performance. Why the slippage? At what point does it become too problematic to actually make meaningful actions?
I have no doubt that most people who go into those roles go in with the best of intentions, and there's no denying that in many cases the companies involved are improving the products they're selling. So there's no denying that a Nissan Leaf is a better product than what was being sold before, or other small cars being sold by the same company. You know, there's no denying that Ricoh's photocopiers aren't more efficient than they used to be. The products are getting greener. The problem we have is the pace at which the volume of production is expanding. So there's a disconnect between what's actually happening as a consequence of all of these individual consumer and company decisions and what's actually required according to the climate science. So for example, you have General Electric advertises its new jet engines, which are 15% more efficient than the previous generation, right? And that's a good thing. But General Electric is also saying they want to have 62% more jet engines that they've produced in the sky within the next few years. So even if the new product is more efficient than the old one, the overall impact of the company's products sold under its brand is growing, and that's what's being replicated across every product category. You know, the same thing you find with Volkswagen and Audi. I mean, Audi famously had a Super Bowl commercial called the Green Police, where they had, you know, this new police force running around stopping people up, pulling them up for the smallest of green infringements, whether it was, you know, a polystyrene cup or, you know, having the spa temperature too high. So the police would bust through the hedge and arrest these people for not doing the green thing. There was another great commercial VW did for its clean diesel vehicles, where there's a bodybuilder woman and a scrawny hippie male on the beach who spot each other, and, you know, to Etta James, together at last. You know, they run towards each other, and instead of the man swinging the woman around, it's the other way around, and then they say power and the environment together at last, ultra low emissions. Now, they're wonderful ads. You know, they're light-hearted, they're entertaining, they communicate a good solid green point about the product involved. But the problem is every ad for a green product is also an ad for the brand. And so in the case of Audi and VW, and Volkswagen owns Audi, while the new products are getting more and more efficient, the company's selling so many more cars. So in their case, they're selling, I think, 46% more cars than they were, you know, 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So the incremental changes aren't keeping up with the overall impact.
And I guess while there's no sort of accountability, it's very hard to impose any sort of regulatory scheme on companies, because we simply don't know how much they're producing. Is this an argument simply for greater regulation and stronger accountability measures globally?
Look, I think it is, in part. The other part of the problem here is that for that person who joins up as the sustainability person at a big corporation, the whole accounting system for climate change is set up in such a way that it encourages them to focus on that very narrowly framed set of operational emissions, the emissions that happen in-house. So the general operating theory when it comes to carbon accounting is that everyone should take account for their little slice of the supply chain. Okay, so if you're working for the big brand, say a clothing brand, that means that you're not taking account of all of the emissions tied up in growing the cotton, making the shirt now, because in many cases the brand doesn't make anything anymore. It just sells stuff under its brand that is made by a contracting company somewhere. So from the point of view of the brand in-house sustainability person, you know, they're the rules and they're playing by the rules. So as far as they're concerned, they have this relatively small emissions to be responsible for, and if they can improve that, well and good. But the accounting framework doesn't encourage them at all to look beyond that. And so it's only the very brave companies now that are looking beyond that and thinking, hang on, this is a much bigger problem for us. So a couple of examples you see, so with Kraft, which is one of the world's largest food corporations, and you know their emissions in-house are only, I think they're less than 10% of the total emissions tied up with all their products. Similar situation with Panasonic, you know, but different in a way. So whereas we're talking mostly about ingredients into food with Kraft, with Panasonic it's much more about product use. So it's what happens when you buy that television. What are the emissions generated to run all those products for years and years and years? So theirs is more of a product use issue. But both of those companies are now out there measuring those emissions, right? And then, I mean, they're not taking full responsibility for them yet, but they're thinking of them as part of their overall strategy to respond to the issue. And so, the operating general theory we've been operating under has been, if everyone takes responsibility for their little slice, we will fix this problem globally. Unfortunately, what's happening is that the large brand that we know is taking less and less responsibility because they're contracting out most of those manufacturing and input emissions. And so that's being missed.
So you're saying that the likes of craft are actually the rarities, and that in some respects it's actually getting even more difficult to get companies to be responsible for their entire emissions?
Well, I think, sorry, just to finish the previous point, I think as it becomes clearer and clearer that we are not making the sort of progress that the scientists are telling us we have to be making, the idea that this will sort itself out if everyone takes responsibility for their slice is becoming exposed for the sham it really is. So that is simply not going to happen in time. So in most cases, the manufacturing emissions and a lot of the transport emissions and the production of the cotton and the cocoa and the coffee and everything else, that's occurring and expanding at a very rapid rate in countries where there is no pressure to disclose your carbon footprint, either from government or from consumers. And so it's a kind of Bermuda Triangle into which large Western corporations can dump their carbon footprint.
But these issues might be solved by a proper global and accountable trading scheme, right?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
I mean, in the
why.
sense that if everyone in India, if everyone in the small African nations has carbon caps, they're part of a carbon scheme that's global.
The problem is that in all of these developed countries where we're outsourcing a lot of our carbon footprint, none of them have an absolute emission reduction target. So what they're talking about is slowing the rate of emissions growth, which is arguably reasonable because their living standards are so much lower. So if you're talking about, the rate of car ownership or television ownership or number of Coke products per year, they can argue that they should be able to consume more like Westerners. So, that's a legitimate argument. So that's why we're talking about slowing emissions rather than actually cutting emissions from their current levels in most of those countries. So that's why a cap and trade system internationally, which is a far cry. I mean, we can also see at the political level that is not happening in a hurry. I mean, no one is racing towards a global carbon trading system. All we have is a global agreement to agree by 2015 for a framework that might start in 2020. So that's simply not going to happen in what the scientists are telling us is the crucial decade.
But we also know, on the other hand, that self-regulation is unlikely to happen from corporations, because you'll never get corporations to act against their own economic self-interest. So where does that leave us?
Oh, look, it leaves us needing a wake-up call to the fact that that's even happening right now. I mean, as I say, there's a large proportion of the population out there that believe that this revolution is inevitable, that it's going to happen. I don't think it is. And I think the sooner we understand that it's not inevitable, that it's not happening anywhere nearly as fast enough as it needs to. In fact, we're still heading in the opposite direction with almost every multinational corporation. The sooner we dispel that myth and start grasping the reality, the better.
And what can we as consumers or individuals do you think?
Look, I mean, my motivation with writing this is that I felt that, well, first I wanted the question answered, but second, putting knowledge into the hands of consumers, governments and everyone involved in this greenwashing industry was just so vital. The more we as consumers understand about the direction and the disconnect between what's being advertised and what's actually occurring, the more we're likely to buy the greener product. The more regulators and government understands that business isn't leading a green revolution, and the main reason they're not doing it is because individual companies will not get that far ahead of the pack if it means they're going to lose business to their competition. So while you might be a relatively greener company than the next, there's only so far you're willing to go while there is no regulation. So if the governments understand that, they're going to be far more likely to understand the urgency of regulating. And then for the advertising companies that are out there busily promoting green products whilst at the same time gaining a whole lot more business from promoting the dirtier product, you know, the more people understand that that's going on, the less those advertising agencies will be able to get away with thinking, you know, there'll be no consequences for that double standard. And then within those companies, you know, if we get back to that sustainability person at a large company, the more they understand that what their job is taking responsibility for a tiny slither of the overall carbon footprint of their products sold under the brand, which is growing, the more likely they will be to sort of step outside those definitions and start thinking about how can we really reduce the carbon footprint of our brand.
Were you shocked by what you sort of discovered or uncovered in the course of writing this book?
I was mostly shocked by the extent of the disconnect. You know, I expected there'd be a lot of large greenwashing companies out there. I didn't expect that almost every one that I looked at would be a huge greenwasher.
Were there any positive examples? Were there any companies that you would really point to and say these are the examples that we should be highlighting?
Look, there were far fewer than I had hoped. Google is a good example. Google has invested nearly $1 billion in renewable energy, so taking ownership stakes in actual renewable energy companies, for example. They also have, I think they're getting about a quarter of their electricity now from renewable sources, and they're hoping to get up to more like a third quite soon. And they're offsetting all of their remaining emissions. So after they've got a lot of renewable energy, they've offset the rest of it, and they've made a huge investment in renewable energy companies as well. Now, I think that's a great example of a large corporation that can go well beyond what the competition's doing. You know, and you contrast that with some of the other online businesses like, say, Travelocity. You know, if you look at the carbon footprint of the bookings, just the airline tickets that Travelocity sells every year, which is around 165 million, I estimated, you know, you're talking about 5,000 times the emissions that they reckon they're saving by planting about 28,000 trees. You know, it all looks very token, and you know, you just so there's a huge gulf between what one company is doing and another. I mean, another good example is eBay, which sells itself as this great engine of reuse. You know, because we all know that it used to be very focused on selling second-hand stuff, and they have a green team of 500,000 people that's eagerly out there promoting eBay as this great garage sale, when in parallel with the green team and stuff and the heavy marketing, they've also changed their business model, so it's much more now about selling new stuff, new products. So in Australia, eBay has bragged that 78% of what they sell is new. But on top of that, their carbon footprint is rising rapidly. So I think it's up 70% or something in a few years. So, you know, there's a big contrast between a Google and an eBay. And, you know, there are other examples, like there's Triodos Bank in Europe, which doesn't finance fossil fuel projects, for example. And then there are a lot of other smaller examples. There's a couple of beer companies in California that I talk about that are 100% powered with renewable energy. So there are cases, and Whole Foods Market is another, you know, big box company in the US. It's a grocery chain that's now a Fortune 500 company, and it offsets all of its electricity use with renewable energy credits. So, you know, the thing that these companies have in common is that they do something big. They do the big stuff, and you have to wonder, having looked at all these companies, whether a lot of large corporations are really saving money through the amounts that they invest in green marketing, whether they might actually be able to do something big if they redirected those resources.
And in Australia, I think the great elephant in the room is that so much of our power is generated by coal. Where does that put us in this whole environment?
Look, I think all of us in Australia, we perhaps have a distorted idea of our impact on the problem. So to the extent that individual Australians have gone to the trouble of working out what their carbon footprint is, you know, they might have worked out how many tonnes their car generates every year and how many tonnes their household generates through electricity and through waste disposal and that sort of thing. We might have an idea of what we as individuals generate. What comes through from this research is that that is a tiny fraction of our real carbon footprint, which is tied up in all the other stuff we buy. So whether we're talking about televisions or cars or clothes or whatever it is, in almost every case there's this long invisible plume of CO2 that leads out of the country into a developing country where in most cases it's being manufactured, and that's not being counted in our own sort of personal carbon ledger. So we are, as consumers, part of the problem, same problem that the corporations are, and we have the same problem to the extent that we are offshoring our carbon footprint to developing countries that do not have any obligation to reduce their total emissions from their current levels. Right, so it's a big loophole, not just for corporations but for us as individuals.
It's an amazing book you've written and an amazing sort of bulk of research, so I really encourage people to read it. But thanks for coming in to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.